Okay, welcome to the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. I have with me one of the most powerful guests that I believe we have had on our podcast to date. He and I met, we're old friends. He and I met as we had our brains, our minds, and our souls melted at the DeMartini Institute. I believe it was Prophecy One.
Yeah.
I believe it was 7 days of, I don't even know how many hours per day, because I believe we lose track of time and space in that type of setting with Dr. DeMartini. But Courtland Warren is somebody that I've watched and learned from for a lot of years, ever since that time. And every day you're putting out content. Every time you put out something, whether it's the recent TED Talk you're in or the podcast about post-traumatic growth that I got to listen to earlier in the year, you put out profound content that helps me reframe a lot of the perspectives that I even have in I like to think that I give myself a daily dose of empowered thinking. But then when I get in touch with a lot of the work that you put out, Courtland, it really makes a mind shift for me. And so I would love for you to introduce yourself. I'd love our audience to get to know you both personally and professionally, and then we'll get started.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, Dr. Hom or Stanton, I appreciate you. And it says a lot about what I believe is the bond that we made there with DeMartini down in Houston, however many years ago that was. And you were impressive then. And I'm very humbled to be asked to be a part of your podcast today. Believe it or not, it's the first time I've ever been asked to be a part of one. And so
Wow.
I've been all nervous and anxious and all kinds of stuff. So I appreciate this opportunity to grow. And to those of you listening in, thank you for valuing yourself enough to continue your self-understanding, your self-actualization. And I appreciate that about you, though I don't know you personally. I love, respect, and am inspired by people who recognize that the best version of themselves changes every day. And so, again, my name is Courtland. I'm from a small town in southeast Oklahoma. And every time I get a chance to, I mention this small town of Idabel, Oklahoma, because that's home for me. Where I grew up was very simply a black and white town. And I mean that in the literal sense, where the railroad tracks separated the east side from the west side. I lived on the west side of town. And as you know, my life experience it was like they're the haves and the have-nots. And I was in the have-not line. All of the good things that seem to be happening were on the east side of town. And all I wanted to do was be able to change lines, is the truth. All I wanted to be able to do was do that. School was on the east side. McDonald's was on the east side. If you had to go pay bills, that was on the east side. Everything positive seemed to be on the east side of town. Those that lived on the east side of town and came to the west side of town were coming to do transactions that maybe they shouldn't have been doing, right? And so I wanted to be able to change lines, and I committed my life to doing that. I look over, my ancestry, and I couldn't identify any person who had ever created a life that I was inspired by. And I got involved in personal development and transformation as a way out, as a way of seeing the world differently, and kind of answering the call that I felt like was on my life to do something to influence people. I continue to do that, and today is just another step in that journey. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate you all for tuning in.
Courtland, it's that's a big theme about our podcast. Our podcast is called the Future Generations Podcast because it's about the world that, for me, it comes from a very personal space. You just shared with me before we started recording that your son is graduating high school.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter is 16 months old.
Wow.
And so she's a new one. And when she was born, you talk about a perspective change that you can't quantify, but you can feel in a way that it immediately, a question that I had to ask and answer for myself was, what world do I want her to inherit from me?
Mm-hmm.
And so it spurred a lot of the different topics that we talk about, but especially the field of personal development and the field of personal transformation. I believe is often an aside from healthcare.
Right.
It's not always influence in healthcare. It's not therapy. It's not part of the healthcare system. But in my viewpoint, and at least the framework of healthcare that I use, you can't not transform and have well-being. You can't, I believe, and this might be a little bit esoteric for some people, but the disease treatment model often is a label and then let's get you back to where you were.
Right.
But when people come to see me, I often ask them, hey, in 6 to 12 months, if you could paint a picture of what you would love your life to be about, just, if failure is not an option, what would you love? And oftentimes they come up with things that they would never say in a medical practitioner's or traditional medical practitioner's office. And so for you to actually have a life built around that, I mean, I think we're going to go down some pretty amazing routes. I would love, Courtland, if you could actually, if you wanted to say something first.
No, it's all good. We're on the same page. When you look at the word disease, dis-ease, my view is that, whether it be emotional intelligence or however you tend to look at it, you cannot have transformation without it also leading to well-being, and well-being without transformation doesn't exist either. So we're on the same page. We're just providing cures and what that lead to peace of mind. So the work that you've been doing is great, and I'm again just glad to be here.
Courtland, I would love for you to, you mentioned something very profound, like when you look back at your ancestry line and you didn't see a life that was like deeply inspiring for you, and that was a seed of motivation or inspiration for you. But I'm curious if you could maybe look at a major influence, or maybe tell us about one major influence or inspiration from your life that's led you today to where you are today.
My being African American, when I look back, what I first had to come to was that the history of Black Americans didn't start in the United States, even though that was a lot of the curriculum. So when I look back, it was very normal and natural to see struggle, oppression, and so forth. And when I looked at it, doctor, it was not from a place of victim consciousness. It was from a place of responsibility. So regardless of how inconvenient I might feel it is, no matter what I think is challenging, tough, or hard, my life today and the years that I have lived paled in comparison to what challenge and struggle was for ancestors. So it was not from a place of blame or even guilt. It was from a place of, I have an incredible responsibility because these people found a way to survive, perhaps with the idea that one day a family member of theirs would have an opportunity. So that was more of like the impetus. As far as mentors and influences go, for a long time, all of my mentors have been, really, they've been dead people. And by that I mean they've been authors of books. I did not have the model, and I cannot impress upon anyone enough the value of having someone who is willing to guide, who's willing to teach. I've not had that. And so I found a lot of my mentors in books, be it Napoleon Hill, be it James Allen, As a Man Thinketh, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I continue to look for books that would inspire. Now, that said, my dad, who, he left when I was 4 and never, ever gave me a birthday gift or a Christmas gift. What he did, though, when I was a junior, and excuse the long answer, but I think it'll help things come together. What he did do when I was a junior in high school, I was at the state track meet, and he met me there to see me run. Prior to that track meet, we had been in conversations, and he was a glass installer. And so he would go to homes and businesses installing glass and mirror. And what he said to me was, he noticed that in some of the most massive homes that he would go into, he noticed that they had libraries. All of those homes had libraries. And he was quick to say, not just a bookshelf, they had libraries.
Mm.
And so I said, well, okay, well, what are they reading? What's in there? And he's like, well, I don't really know. But the next time I'm in one, I'm gonna get some titles. And so we have been talking about that. And the first title that he came back with was All Around the Town by Mary Higgins Clark.
Mm.
I went to the public library and got it. It was a mystery novel. And so, but then I called him. I said, I read this All Around the Town by Mary Higgins Clark. He's like, you actually went and got the book? I said, well, yeah, I want to know how to have that life. He said,
Mhm.
well, no. I don't think that that's what they're reading. So anyway, when he met me at that track meet, my junior year, he met me with, you remember the old milk crate?
Yep.
He's after the meet was over, the team's on the bus, and he says, walk over here with me. We go to this big glass truck that he had driven to the track meet in, and out of the back of the truck, he hands me this milk crate full of books. And I went back to that bus, Dr. Hom, with such pride. Man, my chest was out. My dad had just given me something. And when I get on the bus, all my teammates are there. And they're like, what's that? I was like, man, my dad gave me this. And I mean, it wasn't wrapped. It wasn't gift wrapped. It was in a milk crate. And I sat there. We won the state championship, by the way. And while they were celebrating on the bus, I started going through these books that my dad had given me. And it was about a 4-hour drive from Oklahoma City back to Idabel. And as I'm reading, and it was books like Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill,
Wow.
How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, It's Not Over Until I Win by Les Brown.
Wow.
You Were Born Rich, Dennis Waitley, Seeds of Greatness, Og Mandino, The Greatest Salesman in the World. All these books were crammed into this milk. Now, I obviously didn't finish the books in that 4-hour drive, but that is what started. And as I opened those books and began to read those pages, it was as though, like you said, it wasn't taught in school, but it made more sense. It
Mhm.
wasn't, it was more practical. And so that started my journey. So an influence would be my dad, but in that type of kind of reverse way. So I get home with the books, and my mom asked me immediately, where'd you get that? I said, oh, dad gave it to me. And she immediately made me leave out of the house and get rid of them, because that was the nature of her relationship with him, right?
Wow.
She wanted
Yeah.
nothing from him in our home. So my grandma, who lived literally across the backyard and through a little alley, I went over to her house, and she had a little tarp back there. I covered the books with that, and then one by one, I would go get the book. So I know it's a long story, but a lot of my mentors have been authors, and in a kind of unique way, my dad was really the influence in my transformation and development. And so since that time, that's when I began reading, studying, and ultimately, it led, to our meeting there with Dr. DeMartini.
I mean, I think that story is it's a testament to how the universe conspires,
Oh,
right? Like a lot of people and you made up another. We're going to come back to another point, because you mentioned victim consciousness versus responsibility, and we're gonna go back to that. But this may also be about that, because some people who have a history like you do, where your dad was gone by the age of 4, and then he's back in your life, say around your junior year, might be tied to a frame of what a father figure should have been, or could have been, or would have been. And then he brings you, this box of books, and it takes a special person to be a vessel for that, to
Right.
actually recognize that this is this is actually, obviously something that you had asked about as far as the shelves and what types of books. And you read a Mary Higgins Clark book to show how what level of commitment you're starting from
I was
at high
hungry,
school
man. I
stage.
was hungry. I'm like, show me how to change lines. Get me
Yeah.
out of this have not line. I want to change lines. I want to transform my life, and that's what the Future Generations podcast is about. And I can relate to, the feeling as a father, of how is the world, what world will my child inherit? And really the looming question, for me, and I believe a lot of your listeners, a looming question is, whose life will be better because I lived here?
Mm.
Whose life will be better because I lived? And when it comes to leaving a legacy, and you talk about future generations, when it comes to leaving a legacy, it requires a degree of unselfishness,
Yeah.
because you're not going to always be able to see the benefits of your contribution. If you write a book or start a business, you don't get to see all of the people or all of the lives that are touched by that. I believe it's Macklemore who sings a song. It's called "Glorious," and in the
Yep.
song, there's a
Yep.
line where he says, "They say you die twice. One is when they bury you in the grave. The other is the last time someone mentions your name."
Wow.
We can actually influence the last time our name is mentioned. For most people, they get about 2 generations, and then no one's talking about them anymore.
Hmm.
So who's the person? Who's the woman? Who's the man that you must become in order to leave a legacy whereby your name is continually mentioned long after you're not here? And victim consciousness is not the way of thinking or the paradigm that will get you there. Victim consciousness essentially says life is happening to me. Responsible consciousness says I am happening to life. So
Mm.
life is happening to me or life is happening for me. And responsible, and I want to note that there is a difference between being victimized and having a victim consciousness, or victimized versus victimhood. There is no doubt that there are those who are victimized. However, victim consciousness is related to the meaning that I assign to the event. What do I make that event mean about me? So what does it mean that, I didn't grow up with a dad? What does it mean that we never had money? Those can actually just be seen as facts of my life and existence. What do they mean? I get to determine that. And for those who truly desire to leave a legacy and inspire future generations, one of the anchors for creating that life for yourself is being very conscious of the frame. I love your use of that term. Being very conscious of the frame that you allow yourself to exist in, as well as the events and experiences that occur. They're real events, no doubt. There's a difference between being victimized and having a victim consciousness. And victim consciousness is the opposite of responsible.
I love that distinction because oftentimes they get blended, right? And when you
Mm-hmm.
blend those two, it becomes, what happens to you becomes the meaning.
Right,
You can't
right.
separate the two. And at the end of the day, I think I heard you on a podcast say, um, there's no one in the world that doesn't have something bad that's happened. Like every single person in the world has at some point in their life had something bad happen to them. However, that level of meeting, that level of distinction, how much you can separate that victimization from the victim consciousness and the victimhood is where that, I believe that space is what you're talking about. You create that space and you have responsibility and you
Right.
have the ability to act on life and happen to life versus the opposite.
You
Courtland.
know, responsible says, it's kind of like, you remember back in, maybe grade school, early days of math, you learn the number line, and the whole idea was this number line, you got 0, and then to the right is positive, to the left are negatives, and then you're counting back to zero. How many spaces is it, from, 0 on the negative side or the positive side? And then you go through all of that. You learn that, okay, I got it. And then they introduce a concept called absolute value, or the
Mm-hmm.
absolute number. And then all of a sudden you go, okay, 4 to the right or 4 to the left is negative, whatever. And then all of a sudden they were like, okay, well, we don't really care if it's positive or negative, just what's the absolute value? What's the absolute distance from zero? Well, I look at responsibility kind of like that. Absolute responsibility does not suggest that, well, it's my fault, or I'm the reason that it happened, or this event or experience that I lived through, I caused it. Absolute responsibility just simply says, regardless of, what's happened, and not even really, it doesn't even matter how I got here, what happened, where I've been, what I've done, what happens next is up to me. What happens next is up to me. That's absolute responsibility. And in my experience, as I teach and facilitate seminars throughout the country, people want to first know that they're heard. They want to feel heard about whatever the event or experience is. And I empathize with that. I get it. And the pain and the struggle of it is relative to the person experiencing it. Man, it's the worst thing that's ever happened to any human being. And so to debate with someone or to make them wrong for how they feel about what their life experience has been, is futile, because it's relative to the fact I experienced it. Of course, I can find someone who has it worse off than I did, but that to me is, that's a zero-sum game. There's really no point in it. Absolute responsibility, though, says no matter where I've been, no matter what I've been through, what comes next is up to me. And I believe that a person can find a way to live an empowered life from that place and assign the meaning that's necessary to move them forward. For me, it was a crate of books that was a gift from my dad. He had no idea, or maybe he did, what that would spark in me. However, in that place, I started to uncover some truth. And even though my mom didn't want me reading those books, even though she didn't want anything from him or belonging to him in her home, I was like, I got to find out a different way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because in those couple of hours that I read on the way home, this is some of the best stuff I've ever read. So I know she's upset. I'll respect her home. And there's something more that I want to create for myself than what I've seen. So those future generations, that's ultimately what they're doing. It's ultimately what entrepreneurs do. It's what you've done in the medical field. You embarked on, you see a possibility, you see the potential of something, and you have dedicated your life to creating it. And through the power of questions with your clients and so forth, you ask them questions that they are not asked by other medical professionals. But because you're asking the question, it plants a seed that will lead a person to, first through imagination,
Mm-hmm.
seeing what it is that they want. And once we can see it, we can begin to take the actions necessary to have it manifest.
I love that. Courtland, we've covered a lot of ground already, and I'm curious. There's a lot of different topics that you could probably go down. I'm curious, what do you, from your viewpoint of the world at this stage? I mean, we are in the midst of, or in the wake of, probably one of the most tumultuous years that I've seen in
Mhm.
my lifetime, and hopefully that we see in, maybe hopefully in the future lifetimes. Hopefully they get a little bit more.
Yeah.
I don't know what the right word is. However, I guess the question I want to ask you is, what do you think, based upon what we've covered so far, or maybe something different? What are some of the biggest challenges we face today?
Well, that's a great question, and no doubt there are a lot of challenges and a lot of difficulty, and a lot of people who are experiencing challenges and
Yeah.
difficulty. There's no doubt about it. From my viewpoint, nature never deviates, though, from
Mm,
its laws. Nature does not deviate from principle. And so, though we're in it now, there is overwhelming evidence that we have and can lean on that it will get better. It's like after winter, there is spring every single time. After darkness, there is light every single time, right? And in fact, we would not know darkness if there wasn't for light, and we wouldn't know light if there wasn't for the darkness, right? And you'll remember this from some of the work with Dr. DeMartini, in the law of polarity. In order for anything to exist, then its opposite must also be present. We cannot have left without right. There's no up without down. So in the midst of the challenges, yes, we can first find hope and optimism from knowing that if it exists, then its opposite must also exist. And so with that, what I see is the challenge, the great challenge is the limited perspective that the majority have. It's like we can only see the difficulty and the challenge. And I get it. It's in my face right now. I need to get this handled right now. It's like on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those baseline needs being met, before ever reaching self-actualization. I get it. But right now, the challenge is keeping our minds clear on what we are in is not forever. It will shift, and it's because nature says so. It's because the principle says that that is the case. Now, here's what I also see as a challenge. While we're in this, challenging kind of period of time, what are we doing? Meaning individual, so any, the future generations or the person listening to this podcast, the question to be asking yourself right now is, in this time of change and challenge, what are you doing to grow and develop yourself? A part of it is listening to the Future Generations podcast. A part of it is, making sure that you are engaging in self-understanding, self-knowledge, self-development, no doubt. But what are you doing in this period of time? I assure you that sitting on your hands, waiting for things to return to normal is a recipe for disaster. Waiting for things to return to normal when you're in the midst of a pandemic is absolutely futile. We're not going back to normal. So it's as Eric Hoffer, a philosopher, is quoted as saying, in times of change, the learners will inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. The learners inherit the earth, the learned, the people that know everything, find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. So the challenge right now is to be growing yourself in the midst of what for some might be a very dark period. The challenge right now is to have a future orientation and to be growing and developing yourself, even while it's undeniably challenging and difficult. How do you continue to invest in yourself with an eye towards the future, or as Dr. DeMartini would say, by broadening the time horizon? If I'm just looking at right now, it becomes difficult to make decisions for a decade from now. And so that's what I see as the challenge.
I think it's really important to recognize that, and I don't want you all to miss this, right? I recognize this when, again, I always bring up my daughter. Like gestation, you can't hit the pause button on gestation. Like once there's conception and the baby's growing, you can't hit the pause button, you can't hit rewind on gestation. So there are natural laws that must continue. And because there are natural laws, there's a certain sense of order in the universe that we all must recognize, because when there is chaos and when there is hysteria and when there is challenge and when there is trauma, oftentimes we can get caught up in the disorder, in the entropy, in the fact that we don't know up from down, we don't know left from right, but there always is left and right, and there always is. And I believe Dr. DeMartini also says you can't get a one-sided magnet.
Right.
So if you can't get a one-sided magnet, you can't be addicted or stuck on the illusory perspective where there's only one side.
Right.
And in that case, I love what you said about absolute value, absolute responsibility, because, and it might even lead into another question that I want to ask you, because whatever side takes you, whether it's the too far positive or too far negative, the absolute value of that experience or the absolute responsibility that you take from that experience can be to the direct degree of how far that pushed you one way versus the other.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, because I've heard this on a couple other podcasts and I have an answer for it, but no one's ever asked me it. But I want to ask you, because I believe you're an expert in this field. Do you have to, like, how do you say this? Do you have to experience that polarization one way versus the other to actually achieve that level of value? Or is that something you can manifest without that type of stimulus?
My view is that you don't have to.
Yeah.
My view is that I don't have to hit rock bottom to
Mm-hmm.
finally wake up and say it's time for me to make change.
Right.
I don't have to have my relationship fall apart to recognize that this can be improved. And so, it's between, one-sided perspectives though. If I get too one-sided in my perspective, then because nature is governed by balance, and if I exist on the planet, then balance is required for me also. If I get too much of a one-sided perspective, be that infatuation or resentment, then nature has a way of bringing me back into balance. However, that isn't required. You can do that on a day-to-day basis, just in your own kind of natural and normal walk in life. If you find yourself really excited about an opportunity, take a moment and look at the drawbacks of that opportunity. It doesn't mean that you can't still be excited about it, but if your perspective is, man, this has all upside and no downside, take a moment and list 25, 50 drawbacks of this opportunity. The increased responsibility, the increased, tax burden or financial obligation. And so it's a way to bring yourself back in balance because you're working with the law instead of getting too far outside of it. If you find yourself in resentment and, again, that's a one-sided perspective, then look at the benefits of the situation that has occurred and what's great about it. So, and I don't see that as being like too Pollyanny
Yeah.
or positive with no direction. It's just a way to bring yourself into balance, and I do believe that we can govern that to a degree. But no, I don't have to experience the extreme to fully understand and appreciate the opposite. That's my viewpoint. There are ways to do that.
I mean, that's something that I 100% agree with, because I think at any moment's notice, like, I believe the human nervous system, the human experience is such that you have sovereignty. You have
Absolutely,
sovereignty to choose
absolutely.
at every moment's notice, what meaning, what actions, and therefore have a very direct line into what results that you will get into your life in a lot of respects. And so I really, really, really appreciate you saying that. What would you say, if you could verbalize from your viewpoint, your biggest purpose and mission today?
First off, thank you for that question, because that's one that I've been grappling with lately. So
Yeah.
you must have felt that. But I do believe, first of all, I think it's a very romantic idea that a purpose is found. I just don't see any evidence of it.
Mm,
What I believe to be true is we choose, we pick a purpose and determine from the place of decision where we're going to make impact. And right now, I have chosen as my purpose to be a causal agent in the area of personal development, where people get that the mindset is first. There's a lot of great work being done in personal development, and it's my personal view that a lot of it is fantasy. What is promoted a lot in personal development is lifestyle achievement, and so people are chasing cars, homes, and so forth. And so there's a lot of a lifestyle. And the reality is that it's mindset first. So before a seminar on, trading and investing, before, going to a seminar on, real estate and, making money in real estate, which can all go under the umbrella of personal development. It is my viewpoint that you must have the mindset piece first, because if the mind doesn't align, if your beliefs don't align, then whatever you might attain will be lost or sabotaged quite quickly. And so I've made it my personal mission to assist people in aligning the conscious, subconscious, and superconscious level of mind,
Mm.
such that when what you say you want, and when what you believe you can have align, then the how to, the way to do it, the inspiration or idea flows through. But a lot of times what happens is a person might say they want it, but don't really believe that they can have it. So, I want a loving, trusting, committed relationship, but I don't trust men. I learned a long time ago not to trust women, whatever. Person may say, I want to buy a new home, but I can't afford the mortgage payments and so forth. So a lot of times there's a disconnect between what I say I want and what I actually believe.
Hmm.
My purpose right now is to assist people in getting their beliefs to align with what they say they want. Because the truth is, we came into the world with all that we need to be, do, and have what we desire. And life happens, or life experiences happen. And from our life experiences, we start to believe something else. Or an event happens, and there may be a misinterpretation of a life event or experience. So, my dad leaves home 4 years old. Okay, I'm not good enough, or he didn't want me, or I'm not important, I'm not special. Well, that's a misinterpretation of a life event or experience. And so, my purpose right now is to assist people in getting back to the truth about who they are, so that they can go on to live and lead fulfilling and meaningful lives.
What are some of the ways, and obviously this is probably why people hire you to do so, but when you say subconscious, uh, all the way to the superconscious,
Mhm.
how do you align those?
The superconscious level of mind, we don't have to worry about. That's grand, organized design, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That's already handled.
yeah.
Okay. Accessing it is the chore. Okay. And really, doctor, the secret really isn't a secret, right?
Right.
From throughout the ages, there seems to be great debate on many subjects,
Hmm.
but there seems also to be universal agreement on this one idea: we become what we think about. There seems to be a consensus in that idea, is that we become what we think about. And so the way to get alignment between your conscious level, the place of desire, the desired outcome, and the subconscious, the area of belief, is through an emotional connection to an event or experience. And so the same way that the negative, we'll call it, though it's not really, but we'll call it the negative belief of I don't deserve or I'm not worthy, that belief is put in place as a result of my emotional connection, or your emotional connection, a listener's emotional connection to an event or experience. So if I want to undo that, then I get emotionally connected to an event or experience that is the opposite of that belief. I can do that through journaling. I can do that through attending courses and classes. Part of the power of the course that we experienced together was over those 7 days or so. It was emotional. We kind of break. It was fatigue. It was tiring, but as a result of that, we became bonded because we went through that experience together. And so emotional connections to events or experiences is really the prime way. So I would encourage your listeners, find a person, a program that you trust, be it Zoom, be it a live event, through a book, And when you read the books, do the exercises, right? So when you're reading the books and those exercises at the back, actually do some of them, because that can provide you with the connection that's necessary for the transformation.
I think that's a huge point, because oftentimes in personal development, we get into content heavy, right?
Yes.
There's no shortage of content out there, but what there is a shortage of is taking that content and putting it into a material form. When you actually put it into action, not only is it just doing the work, but
Yep.
I believe, since we're talking about the grand organized design, the natural laws, the infinite intelligence that surrounds us, that we're steeped in all over the place and we are built from,
Mm-hmm.
that when you put that content into action, it sends into the universe a more receptive field around who you are. That's
Yeah,
something I believe
absolutely.
for sure.
Yeah.
And when you do that, I mean, that's like in my practice, right? Like it's, how do we say this? I would love your framework on this, because I believe we live in a world today, Courtland, where talking about esoteric things like this is just in the field of because science, hashtag because science. Like, if it doesn't have evidence, and if it doesn't have this, and it's not proven on PubMed,
Right.
it's not a peer-reviewed, randomized controlled clinical trial, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
and it must not exist, right? But when you talk about these natural laws that do exist, I call it sometimes just simply biology, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you can't mistake that we all have one path onto the planet. The gestational process for me is something that I work with. A third of my practice is pregnancy-based chiropractic. A third of my practice is pediatric-based chiropractic. And when I get to see kids and pregnant women heal in a way that helps them achieve, which I use the word achieve very, very specifically, achieve the birth of their dreams, it's them taking control and total responsibility. And the reason why I mention that is we all come on the planet the same way.
Yeah.
It's 50,000 neurons are made and formed per second in utero. And somehow we've been convinced that that's not an intelligent process that's connected with the infinite intelligence that surrounds us. And because of that, because we are all from that, then we have to recognize that what you're talking about is so foundational. Like, you have to have the framework that there is a conscious, a subconscious, but a super conscious. But if you don't recognize that super conscious exists, then there's only a mortal level of existence that you can actually achieve.
Right. You're just, that's it. I mean, I don't, you said it perfect. That's, I want more people to get that. I want more people to get that.
So Courtland, maybe paint the picture for me in what that world looks like when you have touched that many people, when you have influenced and inspired that many people to recognize not only that existence and that connection exists, but they can use that and create whatever it is in their life that they want.
When we achieve that, world peace is the existence, because I recognize then that having my dreams doesn't mean that you have to go without. Me living a fulfilling life doesn't mean that I have to take from someone else.
Ooh.
So it is, in that world, we embrace abundance in that world. In that world, everyone is seen and known, and they get that they are enough just by birthright. They are enough. In that world, men and women are living and experiencing their unique genius and making contribution and adding value to the world. In that world, a person gets that they are worthy of love and acceptance intrinsically, versus I only am worthy of love and acceptance if I perform, behave, or achieve. Right? They get that they are intrinsically worthy of love and acceptance. And maybe most of all, there is care for the planet in which we live. There is a responsibility to leave it better. And in that world, we get that we are all connected. And so it's either win-win, or, it's either win-win or no deal. And
Right.
so I believe that it's possible. And I've just, I've made it my mission to be causal in creating that existence for, if not for me, for generations after me.
That is probably one of the most poetic things that people have said on my podcast so far. I appreciate you saying it that way. It's invariable today that the polarization, the division,
Hmm.
it almost seems like it's intentional today in a lot of respects, where whether it's, you can't watch the news without having some sort of blood pressure going up.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can't, fear, chaos, hysteria seems to be the name of, or just the radio station that keeps repeating over and over and over.
yeah.
Courtland, you mentioned something, and I do want to check in on your time. I want to
Okay.
check in with you that you're okay on time.
Yeah, yeah. I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Because you had a recent TED talk,
Hmm.
and you told the story. Did you tell the story? Was it about your hometown? I know there was Tulsa, but I
Yeah,
know.
no, it wasn't. But the TED Talk. Well, I found a way to give a shout out to my hometown. Now, Ida Bell Oak. I found a way to give a shout out. However, home right now for me is Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's where I currently live. And the TED Talk was around race relations and emotional intelligence. And I use the Tulsa race riots and massacre of 1921 as a backdrop for understanding more on race relations and how emotional intelligence can be applied to it. It's coming up on the centennial of the event. May of 2021 will be 100 years. And I used the TED platform to speak to that event, mainly because the overwhelming majority of people that I meet when I travel never heard of it.
Mhm.
They are literally, and I mean this without any hyperbole, they are literally uh, a philanthropic financier has come through, and there was a belief of where mass graves were, and they are literally now digging up and finding remains of people, because what was reported you bring up the news, what was reported in the news was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 lives lost.
Wow.
And the real number is in the several hundreds. But what was reported, not that it was better, but it seemed, it wasn't as bad. And there was a desire to protect the image of this city. And so I used, the event started with uh, a, a, a black shoe shine boy who had taken a break and went across the street to use the restroom. And because, it was 1921. So that tells you why he had to go somewhere other than where the people whose shoes he was shining could go use the restroom. And on the way down the elevator, he bumps into a young lady whose name was Sarah, and Sarah happened to be white. And when he bumped into her, Sarah made a noise. An observer, person who wasn't even on the elevator, an observer heard the noise and made eye contact with the gentleman. His name was Dick Rowland. And, the teenager, he runs off. Before you know it, he's in jail for sexual assault. And he's being held in the Tulsa jail with a mob outside wanting him to be released. and because they had a way of taking care of that themselves. And you had this area of Tulsa, which was known as Black Wall Street, for its opulence, for the wealth that was being created and generated in that community. And it rivaled that of Wall Street. And you had, so this mob, you had those from the community of Greenwood, all there at the Tulsa County Jail. And, riots ensued. Before long, there was 34 city blocks of that Greenwood district were burned.
Wow.
And lives were lost, businesses destroyed. And even today, it's still 100 years later, and it's not back. But I used the TED stage and platform to speak to, how we can get along, how we can appreciate and value each other, and how, not talking about it though, and not acknowledging it is not the answer. And so we cannot and will not change what we don't own. Whether that's in my life personally, or if I want to do something on a massive scale, it is important to remember I cannot change what I don't own. That's very, very important to understand. And so that's how I used it.
That reminds me of, and I don't believe it's to the degree, but my family emigrated. One side of my family, father's side of the family, emigrated from China in the 1940s, and they were fleeing communist China, murderous, regimes, and they came over with 5 men. My mother's side, they immigrated in 1960 from Taiwan, also fleeing nationalist China, right? Oppression from China. And they came and emigrated to the United States. My father's side in the 40s, they immigrated into a United States that, have you ever heard of the Chinese Exclusionary Act?
No, I haven't.
Basically, it was a national law that basically had very specific ways that Chinese people would be treated in the United States. Okay. It bled into Asian, multiple Asians and things like that. But what's interesting to me is that they chose to leave oppression and come into a different version of oppression, but at the seat of it was a deep sense of American values, which to the day my grandfather died. My grandfather on my dad's side, he served in World War II and supported the United States and Allied forces. And to the day he died, he was a diehard American. Like he loved America. Huh. But what we didn't know growing up was that we used to go to a Chinese cemetery. It's off the 710 and the 60 freeway up in LA. All Chinese headstones. We were raised in my generation. None of us speak our foreign language. None of us speak our native language. So we're a little detached from our history. But later on, one of my uncles, he said, why we go to that cemetery, right? I'm like, I have no idea. I had no idea why, right? He said back in the day, they were building Union Station, all the railroads. A lot of the Chinese people were building the the railroads, and they would just discard. They would die or something. They would discard bodies, just leave them. And so when they built the Union Station and a lot of the mass transport in LA, like the modern mass transport, they started to find bodies.
Oh wow!
A degree of thousands of bodies. Right.
Wow.
So we went to that. Specific cemetery because that is the only place that Chinese were allowed to be buried.
Really?
And wow. I went my whole life. I went almost 40 years of my life not knowing that's why we went. Wow. And it's very interesting because I love when you told the story about Tulsa. 2 things came up for me.
Okay.
One, I had heard the story, but not to the degree that you told it, not to the specifics of how it actually started, not to the pictures of, like you said, aircraft are coming in to actually drop like bombs.
Private aircraft were literally dropping bombs on neighborhoods on citizens and civilians.
All from a misunderstanding.
Huh?
All from a misunderstanding.
Oh, absolutely. All
from misunderstanding.
Yeah, all from, not, from emotional unintelligence.
And
Yeah.
so what came up for me when I heard you tell that story was two things. Is both sides. On one side is me not being Black, not being of the African American heritage. It helped me recognize something new of the story, of the trauma, of the history,
Mm-hmm.
of the victimization, as we talked about from the very beginning of this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
of your history.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know it to the degree, and especially from it coming from somebody as eloquent as you, it hit me in my soul in a way that it helped me become more aware. It helped me hear you.
Mm-hmm.
But on the opposite side, it made me, it spurred a question, and it made me reach out to you to ask, like, how do you, as a man of your heritage,
Mm-hmm.
hearing that story, how do you go from that victimization to create that space between the victimization and the victimhood,
Mm-hmm.
and 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 find total responsibility?
Yeah. It's the through a lot of work
Yeah.
and primarily the quality of resilience.
Mm.
And so resilience by definition, is one's ability to bounce back from whatever life may throw at them. Interesting about those of the Greenwood district there in Tulsa who had created such wealth, and um, what was interesting to me is that was a generation. You talk about future generations; they were one generation removed from slavery,
Wow.
only one generation removed, and look
Wow.
at what they built. So it spoke to the resilience, it spoke to the courage, the motivation, the self-awareness. Yes, but there are, as I think you were referencing, my view is that that's not just my view; it's a shared view that no one gets exonerated from struggle.
Mm.
There's not a class that you can take. There's not a course you can take. There's not a book that you're going to read that will absolve you of adversity and challenge. And so, since adversity is going to visit everyone, what gives you a competitive advantage, or what provides you with a level of distinction, is how do you bounce back from adversity and challenge? There are those who experience traumatic events, and trauma isn't just for, you mentioned your grandfather and World War II. Um, Trauma isn't just reserved for men and women who've, you know, uh, fought war or been in the military. Though I appreciate and acknowledge the service. A lot of times, though, the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD,
Mm.
is really reserved for those from the military. But the reality is that traumatic events happen for everyone. And a person losing their job during the pandemic, if you have responsibility for providing for your family and you lose your job, you lose your way of doing that, it can be a traumatic event. A loss of a loved one. My favorite cousin, closest cousin, brother, friend, cousin, passed away just last week, and that was traumatic for me. So loss of a loved one can be a traumatic event. A diagnosis can be traumatic for some, and so everyone experiences or will have adversity and challenge. Some never bounce back from it. Some never recover. They are never the same. And that's what we usually refer to as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. For the most part, there are those who, once they experience the challenge and adversity, they are able to bounce back. They can at least get back to where they were. That's what happens for the majority. They find a way to dust themselves off and get back to where they were. But there are those, Dr. Hom, who they don't just get back to where they were. They find a way to go further than they've ever been. So they use the trauma, and they find a way to to go further than they've ever been. And you'll hear people say things like, "Man, the best thing that ever happened to me was losing my job. I didn't feel it at the time, but the best thing that ever happened was losing that relationship. Their back was against the wall and they had to call forth from within themselves something that they didn't know was there. And what we now know is that the skills necessary for post-traumatic growth can be taught. And it's actually starting to be, it's starting to become a core curriculum. So what are the tools necessary to, once you experience adversity and challenge, to be able to bounce back? If resilience is a skill, how can we build it up? And perhaps, depending on feedback from your listeners, I feel like I've been talking too much today.
No.
However, depending on feedback from your listeners, maybe I could come back at a different time and just really focus on what we know to be true around curriculum and how to develop resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. So I think that's maybe on a different time. However, that's what I didn't know that I was doing it at the time. But there again, I look back into my life and my great grandmother, great grandfather, and so forth. And I'm like, man, they went through a lot. And I feel like I've gone through a lot. However, it pales in comparison to what they did. So how can I honor myself while honoring them and go further than, because perhaps, there were nights when they were laying out, in the field, or, my grandmother who's deceased now, but she would talk about, picking cotton for a nickel a week. And they worked from, and you and your listeners may appreciate this. She would say, I said, well, how long did you, she said, we worked from can't see to can't see. But what she didn't pronounce, she said, we work from can't see to can't see. We work from you can't see in the morning to you can't see at night. That's how long they worked. And for a nickel a week, So when I look at my life today and opportunities that I have and technology, such as what you're using to produce this podcast, and the liberty to, finance myself, to a personal development course, meet someone like you, stay connected with the help of social media, fast forward to today and be able to share with you and your network, to me, that's just opportunity there, and so though challenging, not as challenging. And so how can I live my life in a way that demonstrates that I am grateful for them not giving up? I'm grateful that they endured what they endured. I am grateful that they were resilient enough that I get a shot.
Man, I think that could be why we connected the way we did.
Yeah.
And I keep bringing up my daughter, but as soon as she was born, I looked into her eyes. It was like, man, like the whole future came in for me. But every day since I've been a parent, it's been compassion for my parents.
Yeah.
It's been recognizing that the plight and the stress and the things that I go through being a dad, my parents, their parents, they already did it, right?
They did it.
And that's just being a parent. That's not talking about all the other things that they had been through. And so at the end of the day, victimization happened, victimhood, I choose to stay as far away from in a lot of respects because I feel like I forsake them. I forsake their journey and their actual, like I have the opportunity today to impact people, to be there for people, to serve the world, to create, to be inspired, to talk to you, to meet you. And it's one of those things for me that, I mean, I'm so grateful. Don't feel like you're talking too much, because I'll be honest with you, like that's just what it's all about.
Okay. All right.
Long form. I don't feel in any capacity, but I would love, I can already tell that this episode is going to echo very positively and empowered throughout our community, and having you to come back to talk about like the actual strategies around post-traumatic growth.
Absolutely.
Is really important, because you don't hear about that. You don't even, like, I think you said in one of your podcasts, you said 95% of the room will often say, PTSD, got it, totally hear about that. Post-traumatic growth, maybe not, haha, like that doesn't really exist.
They actually think that I'm making up the term.
Yeah.
They actually think that I'm making it up. So it's not, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll get you. We'll.
But what I believe and what I appreciate about what you're saying is that even knowing that it exists at all is already evidence enough for people to take it and run with it. There are going to be a certain percentage of listeners that recognize that trauma and all the challenges do happen. There's no one's exonerated, like you said, from struggle. And so if you've had some sort of struggle and some sort of trauma, that knowing that what happens afterwards, there's a spectrum of possibility that oftentimes I would say 50% of that is gone. It's not even a possibility in the framework of what world we live in today. And to know that it's not just trauma and down spiral into like the worst life that you could ever imagine. And it's not just getting back to where you were, that the possibility of post-traumatic growth is that there are strategies and ways to become better than you've ever experienced. I've noticed that in my practice, that you said it exactly right, that the verbiage that comes out of it is that cancer diagnosis was the best thing that ever happened in my life. That C-section delivery is traumatic, and obstetric violence is a classified, published data. It's actually part of the compendium of what can happen in childbirth. That actually was the best thing that ever happened in my life. The injury from that medical product and what I learned as a result of that and how I took responsibility for my health and that of my family's was the best thing that ever happened in my life. And I believe that that is something that will sit with our listeners in a way. And if it makes you uncomfortable, it makes you uncomfortable because you probably didn't know it existed. Don't make it, but that doesn't make it real.
Yeah.
And I want you guys to all understand that. Courtland, last question. What's one thing, if you could charge our audience to do one thing as a result of listening to this podcast, what would it be?
I would say, go ask someone what they're dreaming of or what's a goal that they have, and then commit to assisting them in getting it done. I find it difficult to say I really care about someone when I have no idea what they're dreaming about or what they're working towards. So my challenge, my call to action would be find someone, a family. It could be your intimate, your significant relationship, could be son or daughter. Just find someone who you haven't asked, and ask them what they're working on, what's a goal or dream that they have, and then commit to doing one thing that assists them in getting there. And if you want, if you really want to get extra credit, you want a bonus, do it for or with someone you would normally talk to. Find someone who is from a different, culture, different race, someone who eats different food than you eat, who speaks differently than you. And let's see if we can't do more to bring the world together by supporting each other in getting their dreams.
I love that. I think that is the first time somebody charged us with something that wasn't for our own self-gain.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That is the first time in the, I'll have to go back and check, but that was very profound, Courtland. How do people stay connected with you?
I have a, Facebook, Courtland Warren, well, it's full now. It's the 5,000 limit, but Courtland D. Warren on Facebook. I'm also developing a YouTube channel. It has about, 20, 30 videos on it. And so so those are the channels that I'm using mostly, and along with Instagram. So that's how we do it. Or, if I did a good job here, keep listening to this podcast and I'll be back that way too, but primarily YouTube and Facebook.
And so everyone, just so you know, when you scroll down, whether it's in Apple Podcasts or in Spotify, you'll be able to have all of Courtland's contact information. We'll get that from you, Courtland, and we'll put all the links available for them to stay connected with you. I cannot thank you enough, Courtland. This was one of the most profound conversations that I've had in a long time, and it's because it's just, I think your entire story is so incredibly inspiring. I believe that you bring to the table, and at least to our podcast, it's almost like everything has stayed focused on health. Some of it's been about a subject called health freedom, in terms of like making sure that, you know, patients have informed consent. They have the full information for the medical decisions that they make for their
Oh, okay.
family. And for you to bring what you brought has been an elevation of the energy and the vibration of our content. And I just want to thank you so much for that. I really appreciate
Well, you're very welcome. And to your listeners, thank you. So if this is a deviation from the norm, thank you for listening. I appreciate that. And instead, still when I eat oranges thinking of you. Because when you were like, man, there's so much good in an orange. So there we were. He's like, look, there's so much good in an orange. Oh, so every time I'm eating it, I'm like, all right, I eat it knowing that it's good for me. So you've made an impression on me. I see you as a leader. I would follow you, and I appreciate the encouragement, and any way that I can be of continued service and support to you and your desire to impact the world in a positive way. Call me up, provide me with the opportunity, and I promise you I'll do my best to deliver on it. And so
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much, Courtland. I appreciate your time, your talent, your contribution, and your heart more than anything. I love the authenticity, and at the same time, like, every aspect of this conversation has been wonderful. Thank you for your time, man.
Thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. And to your listeners, thank you also. Have a good one.